Some people dream of fancy mansions with white picket fences. Me? I just want a quiet life. A home where I could work with my hands, drink my morning coffee in my garden, and watch my dog, Rusty, run around without a care in the world. For 3 years, I built that dream. My little house wasn't the fanciest in the neighborhood, but it was mine. My workshop, where I handcrafted furniture, was my pride and joy. My tomato plants had even won first prize at the county fair. Life was good. And then, overnight, everything changed. It started with a smell, thick, foul, and wrong. Even with the windows shut, it seeped into my home like an uninvited guest. Rusty whined, pawing at the back door, but when I opened it, he bolted back inside. I stepped out and instantly gagged. My yard, my beautiful yard, was flooded, but not with rainwater. Sewage, thick, bubbling, putrid waste spread across my lawn like some nightmarish swamp. My garden, the one I'd spent years perfecting, was drowning in filth. My workshop, where I built pieces with my bare hands, was now a contaminated mess. I stood frozen, trying to process the horror in front of me. How? Why? Who did this? Then the anger kicked in. This was an accident. Someone did this. And I was going to find out who. I grabbed my phone and called the HOA's emergency line. 20 minutes on hold. Just when I was ready to throw my phone against the wall, Karen Thompson picked up. Karen, the HOA president, the woman who had made it her mission to remind me that I didn't fit in her precious neighborhood. Mr. Reynolds, she said, her voice dripping with impatience. I'm very busy today. What seems to be the problem? I clenched my jaw. Karen, my backyard is flooded with sewage. There's a pipe dumping waste directly onto my property. I need this fixed now. She sighed dramatically. Oh, that? We authorized some minor plumbing adjustments yesterday. It's probably just a temporary side effect. I nearly dropped the phone. Side effect? Karen, my property is ruined. This is a health hazard. She made a noise like I was being dramatic. We'll send someone out to look at it next week when our maintenance team is available. Next week? I felt my blood pressure spike. Karen, I can't live like this for a week. My yard is destroyed. My home smells like a landfill. Well, Mr. Reynolds, perhaps you should have thought about potential drainage issues before buying property in Maple Grove. That sentence hit like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just brushing me off. She was saying outright, I wasn't welcome here. I wasn't one of them. I didn't drive a shiny luxury car. I worked with my hands instead of sitting behind a desk. I wasn't part of their elite little club. I hung up. Fine. If the HOA wouldn't help me, I'd find someone who would. I called the county health department. Their response? We can send someone Friday. That meant 3 more days of living in this nightmare. That night, I couldn't sleep. The stench seeped through the walls, invading my home like a silent punishment. Rusty refused to go outside. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at old photos of my garden in full bloom. I couldn't just sit here. I had to do something. So, the next morning, I went looking for answers. I followed the sewage uphill, trying to find its source. That's when I saw it, a new pipe partially hidden behind some bushes, actively spewing waste. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't nature. Someone had installed this. I pulled out my phone, snapping photos, taking video evidence. I was so focused I didn't notice Howard Wilkins, the HOA treasurer, until I heard a sharp whistle. Howard, in his crisp polo and khakis, stood nearby, his tiny poodle perfectly groomed at his feet. Howard, I called. Come look at this. He hesitated. I knew he heard me. I waved him over again, and finally he walked up, keeping his distance from the mess. What's all this? He asked, feigning innocence. I pointed at the pipe. That wasn't here last week. It's dumping sewage into my yard. This is HOA property. You guys installed this, didn't you? His face twitched. I'm not aware of any installations. Must be a county issue. I frowned. Karen told me the HOA authorized plumbing changes. His eyes flickered. I'm afraid she must have misspoken. If you'll excuse me, Precious needs a morning walk. He yanked the poodle away as fast as he could. I stood there, staring after him, anger burning in my chest. They were lying. They knew exactly what they had done. Silenced by fear. By day 3, my yard had transformed into a swamp of filth. The stench was unbearable. My neighbors, people who usually ignored me, started calling, but not to complain to the HOA. They complained to me. Karen had told them it was my plumbing that failed, that I was responsible for the mess. That night, I stormed into the HOA meeting, ready to fight. I had photos. I had videos. I had proof. But when my turn came to speak, Karen barely concealed her smirk. "You have 3 minutes, Mr. Reynolds." I connected my tablet to the projector. The images appeared, sewage gushing from the HOA-installed pipe, my property drowning in waste. This was installed by the HOA last week. I said, "It's destroying my property, and I demand it be fixed." Karen leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "The HOA has no record of such an installation." I pulled out my phone. "Then why did you tell me on Tuesday that the HOA had authorized plumbing changes?" Her face went pale. "You're recording me?" she hissed. I wasn't, but she didn't know that. "If you had nothing to hide," I said slowly. "Why would you be worried?" Her fingers clenched around her phone. "Your time is up, Mr. Reynolds." I clenched my jaw. They were shutting me down. But as I turned to leave, a man quietly followed me. "I'm Daniel Hoffman," he murmured. "I live on Oak Drive. They did the same thing to me last year." My breath caught. "What?" "They needed somewhere to redirect their drainage. My land was the lowest point before yours." I fought back, but Karen's husband's company bought my house when I couldn't afford to fight anymore. He fixed the drainage and resold it for double. My blood ran cold. This was their plan. They were trying to force me out. I drove home in silence. And when I pulled into my driveway, I saw them, Karen and Howard, standing at the edge of my yard, pointing, making notes. They scurried away when they saw me watching. I wasn't just being targeted. I was being hunted. That night, I couldn't sleep. But this time, it wasn't because of the smell. It was because I was done being their victim. If they wanted to fight, I was going to give them one. And they had no idea what was coming. Some fights happen in the open, loud, clear, and direct. Others, they happen in secret, behind closed doors, whispered in emails no one is supposed to see. Karen's mistake was underestimating me. One night, while checking my email, I noticed something odd. Someone had mistakenly CC'd every single homeowner in the neighborhood on an internal HOA board email thread. At first, I thought it was spam. Then I started reading. Subject: Reynolds Situation Containment Strategy. The diversion was necessary. Fixing the main line would have required a special assessment of $22,000 per household. We need to stick to the story, deny everything until he gives up. Then came Karen's response. Reynolds' lot was always meant to be a drainage point anyway. If he complains, we deny everything. He can't afford legal action, and by the time the county inspector responds, we'll have our story straight. I felt my stomach tighten. It got worse. His house is the cheapest in the neighborhood anyway. Should have never been approved. My jaw clenched. My hands curled into fists. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't bad luck or poor planning. This was intentional. They had deliberately chosen my land to be the dumping ground for their sewage because I wasn't one of them. They thought I was just some working class nobody they could bully out of the neighborhood. They thought I'd just give up. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Fighting back alone is hard, but fighting back with a team, that's how you win. I started small. I reached out to the neighbors who had given me sympathetic looks during the HOA meeting. 5 of them showed up to my house that weekend. The first to speak was Jennifer Williams. They denied my wheelchair ramp request 3 times, she said, shaking her head. Said it would ruin the aesthetic. I had to pay $7,000 out of pocket just to install it, and they still fined me. Next, Michael Chin. They fined me $500 a day for installing solar panels, he said, his voice bitter, even though state law protects them. One by one, the stories poured out. Unexplained fines, altered property records. Secret HOA projects that benefited board members. We were all victims of Karen and her cronies. By the end of the night, we had a plan. We created the Maple Grove homeowners for fair treatment, and we were going to take Karen down. For the next week, I barely slept. I spent every spare minute gathering evidence. I dug through public records. I visited the county office and found something interesting. The HOA never properly filed permits for their new community center's plumbing system. Even better, their office was closing for renovations next week. That meant no security cameras, no witnesses, no staff, and that's when I had the idea. A big one. I picked up the phone and called my cousin Ryan. Ryan ran Reynolds Concrete, a small family business. The guy knew everything about pouring foundations, sidewalks, and driveways. Ryan, I said, how much concrete can you deliver in one night? There was a pause. Then he chuckled. You're up to something, aren't you? 9. Justice takes shape. The night before the HOA office closed for renovations, I stood in the parking lot, watching. The workers were packing up furniture, hauling out computers, even carefully wrapping Karen's massive self-portrait, a hideous oil painting of her sitting in a throne-like chair. Inside, the office was completely empty. Perfect. At 2 a.m., Ryan pulled up. We had covered his concrete truck's logo with a sign reading County Maintenance. Step 1. Pick the lock. Thank you, YouTube. Step 2. Run the hose through the mail slot. Step 3. Start pouring. Thick, gray concrete oozed into the office. I aimed it straight for Karen's desk first, then the filing cabinets, where they kept records of fake fines and property violations. Slowly, everything vanished beneath the rising tide of cement. Ryan checked his watch. We got 15 minutes left. I grinned. Plenty of time. I grabbed a pair of gloves, pressed my hands into the wet concrete on Karen's desk, and pulled them out, leaving a perfect imprint. A calling card. By 4:30 a.m., we were gone. By 8:30 a.m., all hell broke loose. I was sitting on my porch, sipping coffee, when I heard it. A loud, piercing scream. Karen. I pulled up my phone and checked my hidden security cameras. Karen stood outside the HOA office, furiously jiggling the door handle. She kicked it. She shoved it. Nothing. Then she looked inside, and her body went rigid. Through the glass, she saw her office completely filled with solid concrete. Her desk, her fancy gold-plated awards, her precious HOA records, all buried under cement tomb. Her face turned a shade of red I didn't know existed. Reynolds, she shrieked. Oh, she knew. But before she could even process the destruction, another black sedan pulled into the parking lot. A man in a suit and sunglasses stepped out. Daniel Wright, District Attorney's Office, Environmental Crimes Division. He was holding a file with Karen's name on it. She barely had time to react before 2 police officers stepped out behind him. Mrs. Thompson, Daniel said, holding up a search warrant. We need to talk. The fallout. By noon, news vans lined the street. By evening, the whole town knew. Karen wasn't just guilty of illegally dumping sewage. She had been stealing HOA funds for years. She had taken bribes from contractors, altered property records, and falsified environmental reports. The entire board was under investigation. And the best part? They had no idea who had flooded their office with concrete. Detective, Karen sputtered as she was escorted into a police car. I want to report crime. Someone filled our office with. The detective sighed. We'll add it to the list, Mrs. Thompson. I watched from my porch as Karen was driven away, her precious HOA empire collapsing behind her. 6 months later, the HOA was under new leadership. Jennifer was now president. Michael got his solar panels back. And me? I finally got my garden back. One afternoon, I received a package. Inside was a small chunk of concrete, mounted like a trophy. There was a note. Thought you'd want a souvenir. Sometimes, the strongest solutions fix the hardest problems. D, right? I placed it on my desk and smiled. Revenge is a dish best served. Solid. As Karen stood outside the HOA office, frozen in shock at the concrete-filled disaster, a black sedan pulled into the parking lot. The doors opened, and out stepped a man in a sharp gray suit, sunglasses perched on his nose. He carried a leather briefcase, his posture calm, collected, but there was an authority to the way he moved. Daniel Wright, District Attorney's Office, Environmental Crimes Division. Karen's face lost all its color. She knew exactly who he was. "Mrs. Thompson," Daniel said, flipping open his briefcase. "We need to talk." For the first time, Karen, the always in control, always smirking queen of the HOA, looked small. And then, as if the universe wanted to deliver the final blow, her right-hand man, Howard the treasurer, suddenly panicked. Without warning, he bolted. "Bad move. Stop right there," an officer barked. Howard didn't make it 5 steps before 2 officers tackled him to the pavement. His briefcase flew open, scattering bank statements, fake invoices, and financial records across the ground. I stood on my porch, watching with a cup of coffee in hand, and thought, well, that's convenient. Daniel adjusted his sunglasses. "Looks like we just found even more evidence." Karen's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. And then came the cherry on top. A local reporter, microphone in hand, turned to Karen. "Mrs. Thompson, do you have any comment on the HOA office being filled with concrete?" Karen whipped around, her face deep red. "That was him," she shrieked, jabbing a finger in my direction. "Reynolds did this." The reporters turned to me. The police turned to me. And I raised my coffee cup and toasted her. Karen lost it. "You have to arrest him," she screeched. "He filled my office with—" Daniel Wright sighed, snapping his briefcase shut. "Mrs. Thompson, I think your priorities are a little misplaced right now. But perhaps you should be more concerned about the felonies you're facing rather than a creative act of protest." She opened her mouth to argue, but just then, an officer handed her a warrant. "This is authorization to search your home and personal accounts," he said. Karen stumbled backward. I could see the moment it hit her. This wasn't just about me. This wasn't just about sewage. This was about everything. The fraud, the stolen HOA funds, the shady deals. Everything. An hour later, Karen and Howard were both in handcuffs. The best part? Nobody could prove I had anything to do with the concrete. Ryan's truck had no company logos. The HOA's own security cameras weren't working that night. And the only evidence left behind was a mysterious pair of handprints in the concrete, something that could have been done by anyone. A detective approached me later that day. He crossed his arms. "We know you did it," he said. I took a sip of my coffee. "Got any proof?" A long pause. Then he smirked. "Enjoy your day, Mr. Reynolds." With Karen and her cronies gone, the HOA had no leadership. And for the first time in years, the people in this neighborhood felt something new. Relief. At the emergency HOA meeting, Jennifer, the woman who had been denied a wheelchair ramp, stood up. "I'd like to nominate myself for HOA president," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. Michael, the guy who had been fined for solar panels, stood next. And I second that. One by one, hands went up. Karen's old supporters? Silent. Jennifer was elected unanimously. Her first act as president? Waiving all unfair fines. Reversing years of ridiculous HOA rules. Making sure the HOA actually worked for the homeowners. And me? "You should run for the HOA board," Michael suggested. I shook my head. "No thanks. I've had enough HOA drama for a lifetime." But I did offer one thing. "I'll help with the community garden." I said, "It's about time we grew something good around here." Jennifer smiled. "I'd like that." 14, a community reborn. Over the next few months, everything changed. For the first time, people in the neighborhood actually talked to each other. We replanted trees. We repainted fences. We helped each other instead of finding each other. Even better, the HOA finally cleaned up my yard. The county environmental team removed all the contaminated soil. They even rebuilt my workshop, all paid for by the HOA's insurance. The first morning I woke up and stepped outside, I almost didn't recognize my own backyard. The air was fresh. The grass was green. Rusty ran circles around me. his tail wagging furiously. I knelt down and ran my hands through the clean, untouched dirt. For the first time since this nightmare started, I could finally breathe again. A few months later, I got a package in the mail. Inside was a small chunk of concrete, mounted like a trophy. There was a note attached. Thought you might want a souvenir. Sometimes, the strongest solutions fix the hardest problems. D, right? I chuckled and placed the concrete on my desk. A reminder that when people push you too far, when they take everything from you, when they think you won't fight back, sometimes you have to teach them a lesson they'll never forget. Rusty barked, snapping me out of my thoughts. I looked outside at my garden, now thriving. My tomatoes were growing again, bigger and better than ever. That evening, Ryan stopped by. We sat on my porch, watching the sun dip below the trees. Was it worth it? He asked, glancing at the concrete trophy. I thought about everything. The stress, the fear, the satisfaction of watching Karen get hauled away in handcuffs. I took a sip of my lemonade, then smiled. You know what they say, I said, raising my glass. Revenge is a dish best served solid. The end.